Good morning, everyone. This is Dennis Sisi, and I want to welcome you to our first part of Spiritism 101 here at Soul, at Spiritism Online. I'm really excited to try this new platform so that we can come together and talk about Spiritism. So, welcome. Thank you for joining me on this road. Okay, so today, for a couple of minutes, I want to give you a little bit of a primer about what is Spiritism so that it can feed our future conversations ahead of our online session where we are going to be able to interact with each other a little bit more and ask questions of each other, make comments, and the like. So, this video today is meant to serve as fodder so that you can start to process some information and try to make life a little bit easier for you. And so bring your questions. Bring your questions after this and after the other readings so that we can talk about them together, be it on our online discussions, be it in the forums, or just by connecting directly via the platform as well. Okay, so what is Spiritism? It's fitting to start with the question of what is Spiritism? Much the same way that Allan Kardec started the Spirits book, which is the seminal book of Spiritism, the foundation of Spiritism, from whence everything else springs, with the question of defining the term. So much the same way Kardec started by defining the term Spiritism and the introduction of the Spirits book, which is one of the materials that we have available for you to read. It's a short paragraph, but a very powerful and very important one. We too here at Soul, for this course, are going to start with the idea of defining Spiritism. And why is that important? So that we begin to understand the whole breadth and depth of Spiritism and are sure not to be confused by what it is not. There's a lot of confusion out there about what Spiritism is, and today we hope to take the first step to make that less of a confusing matter for all of us. All right, so let's get this going. I look forward to your feedback as well, so make sure you know and remember that you can always interact with me or anybody else, the part of our study group, via the platform. All right, so I feel that the best definition of Spiritism that I have ever come across has come from Kardec himself in a little publication called What is Spiritism? And in that publication, Kardec says that Spiritism is a science that studies the nature, the origin, and the destiny of spirits, as well as their relationship to the physical world. And it's a really beautiful and really powerful and comprehensive definition. What I'm proposing here and I have for you, it's a slightly different one that substitute the word science for the term dynamic body of knowledge, just because the word science has changed its meaning a little bit over time. Nowadays, oftentimes we think of science as a test tube science that requires numbers and calculations and things, whereas in its original meaning, it had to do with the rigorous and rational process of arriving at knowledge. And so sometimes people get stuck in the word science, so I've changed it here in this particular definition to a dynamic body of knowledge because I feel that Spiritism is always growing. But before we start jumping into the definition per se, like I said, there's a lot of things in here that we want to maybe dissect. And to make that easier, at least for me, I've color-coded some of the key parts of our conversation here so we can understand different components that also go into Spiritism. So if you look at the screen, you're going to see that there are different key terms that I've highlighted. There's a dynamic body of knowledge, that is studies. There's nature, origin, destiny, spirits, and relationship to the physical world. All of these, I feel, work together to give us a very comprehensive picture, and it might behoove us to take our time to slowly go through them and picking each one apart for us to better understand the whole. We're not going to be really detailed here. We're not going to go in too much depth because this is supposed to serve as a primer for us. But I hope that you will whet your appetite so that we can get those conversations going. Okay, so let's start with the dynamic body of knowledge. What is fascinating about Spiritism is that it has started with facts. The DNA of Spiritism is one of inquiry. The way that Spiritism came about really tells us a lot about what it is and what it proposes to do. And why is that interesting? Well, if you think about it, almost all religious bodies of thinking in general have arrived at a certain philosophy of how the world is and how things ought to be, and what is the right thing to do and versus the things that are not so great for us to do. And based on this larger philosophy, people start to interpret that into everyday ideas and then decide actually how we should live our lives. So it's a interesting process that goes from the largest to the smallest. Spiritism, much like science, comes from a different perspective. It starts with little facts that lets us build ideas that eventually lead us to a philosophy. And that is what's really interesting here, because it kind of seems to come from a different perspective, which allows Spiritism to always grow. Spiritism is always on the lookout for new facts and new ideas and new interpretations of things. And if we feel that there are new facts that give us a different interpretation of what we used to think of before, we ought to change our minds and go with the flow. That is a departure, as you can understand, from many religious bodies of thinking, many religions in general, who tend to protect their thinking process and do not accept any other external influences. So that is one key aspect of Spiritism that is different, that is really interesting, because it really tells us that we too should always be growing and learning new things, that we should always be enlarging our knowledge, growing our body of knowledge. And so Spiritism started with Allan Kardec, but it did not end there. Everyone is invited to contribute and add to the body of knowledge at large so that all of us can benefit. And throughout this course, especially at the end, we'll talk a little bit more too about the other people who have come after Kardec and have enlarged the body of knowledge. So we talked about how the way that Spiritism was brought about as an important factor for us to understand its nature in general. So it's important for us to go back a little bit and hear about its history to better situate our thinking. Even though we are going to go into a little more depth in the future, and the next module is about the history of Spiritism if we want, it's interesting to revisit briefly, because as we may be aware, Spiritism really came from that investigation of some interesting phenomena that were taking place in the 1850s in Paris. At that point in time, many different people were finding in their gatherings, which, remember, they didn't have Netflix, they didn't have TV, they got together in salons to talk and let the time go by, that there were some objects that were moving by themselves, namely some tables, which originated a larger phenomena called tipping tables or turning tables, where tables seemed to move by themselves when people were gathered around the tables, concentrating and asking them to move. Of course, this is not traditional. I think none of us expects our tables to tip or move when we're having dinner together as a family or in a restaurant. But it started to happen in that time in the 1850s. And some people really thought it was interesting. Some people thought it was really entertaining. But other people were piqued by their curiosity, and they were trying to understand why that is happening. Some of them eventually asked Professor Rivel, which was an established educator of the time, who later we will know by the name of Allan Kardec, to investigate these phenomena. And he did. And he was fascinated by the idea that tables could move, because at the end of the day, tables cannot move by themselves. They don't have a brain. They don't have a central nervous system. So they're incapable of movement, as all of us know and hope. So immediately he understood there was something else happening behind that phenomena. Something was propelling those tables to move. And as people began to give commands to the tables, move to the left, move to the right, Kardec quickly understood that there were intelligent forces at play here. Eventually, they develop a communication method, and they get validation that is indeed the fact. So another part that we want to study here is this concept of spirits, which is central to Spiritism. We cannot have Spiritism, as the name implies, without spirits. And how do we come across the idea that there are spirits out there? How do we get that validation that's indeed the case? Well, that whole idea of spirits really comes from these phenomena that Kardec studied. By studying those phenomena, he developed this communication method along with other people where questions started to get asked to those tables who were moving. And, knock once for yes, knock two for no. Or eventually they developed something that was then called tiptology, which is assigning a knock for every letter of the alphabet. One knock for A, two knocks for B, three knocks for C. And you can see how tedious and how long communications following this primitive spiritual Morse code, so to speak, would take. Eventually, in these conversations with these tables, quote, quote, which we know cannot possibly be tables, Kardec's supposition that there was forces at play that were guiding the tables confirmed themselves, as these intelligences told us that they were spirits. They were the essence of those who had lived before and who are now trying to communicate with us to give us the certainty that they still lived on. So that all came about from Kardec's really interesting perspective that for every effect, there is a cause, that everything that we have in the world was caused by something else. And for every intelligent effect, there is an intelligent cause. If something seems to be behaving in an intelligent manner, then something intelligent has triggered that, because you cannot have something intelligent coming out of chaos, out of nothing. So the fact that the tables were answering questions and were behaving in an intelligent manner meant there was an intelligent force behind that guiding it. And eventually, as we know, they tell us they are the spirits, the intelligence of those who have lived before, and the whole thing starts. So as you can tell here, the history of Spiritism really starts with the exploration, with the search for understanding without necessarily a hidden agenda. It wasn't a spiritual leader saying, I'm going to come out with a way of doing things. It was Kardec investigating the world around him and drawing conclusions and asking questions with these intelligences. And everything starts from there, because from the moment that we understand that there are other intelligent beings out there who can communicate with us, it leads us to think about us, who we are, what is our nature. Because if they are telling that they are just like us, except that they are devoid of a physical body, then it gets us thinking, doesn't it? What happens here? And so Spiritism concerns itself with the nature of spirits. That is, what are spirits? And the spirits themselves told us that we are just like them, that we are actually spiritual beings having a physical experience, and not the other way around. We're not bodies that have a spirit. We're not this physical body who, once we die, will then have a spirit. No. We are spirits who are living a spiritual existence and who take a physical vessel, a physical body, from our birth to a death to learn new things. And it starts to fundamentally change the way we think, because it starts to let us arrive at the idea that there's more than just a physical world. And that's a fundamental shift, especially in the 1850s, and very much so today, where we tend to think about everything that's physical and not worry very much with the values of the spirit. So through those experimentations, through those phenomena, we're able to arrive at the idea that they're spirits, and now we start questioning our own existence, our own nature. And as we do that and we continue to have those conversations with the spirits, we realize that we also start to question ourselves, so where do we come from? If we are immortal beings who are temporarily donning a physical vestment, then where have we come from? And the conversation with the spirits about our origin continues, and they too tell us that we have come from God. That even though it's hard for us to understand, They are able to see further down the road because they are no longer encumbered by a physical body. And they tell us that there is a God, that there is this underlying force that guides everything in the universe. And yet, one more time, we have a validation of the ideas that we might have had before, but that we struggle to make sense. And they also talk to us about a kind God, reminding us of the teachings of the Christ and re-explaining some of them, which we can go back more into detail. But central to the concept of Spiritism is the idea that the universe is under control, that God watches for all of us. And it's important to notice here too, and sometimes I joke around with this, that if the word God is perhaps too impactful for you, perhaps we have some emotional baggage with that and we don't like that, you can substitute that for anything else. Sometimes I joke around and say that God is just an acronym for the grand old dude. Whatever it is that you want to call it, please feel free. The one, the Tao, the energy, the force. The important piece is to recognize the concept here, the concept that there is a God in the creation that takes care of us. So that's a central point of Spiritism as well. So after we go into the idea of the nature and origin of spirits, one of the things that comes to our minds naturally is, okay, if I am indeed a spirit created by God, then what's going to happen to me? What's my destiny? What's my future? And those questions were also posed to the spirits, and we find a lot of them in the Spirits book, which is perhaps the next course for us. The Spirits tells us that we are evolving, that we are constantly evolving, that God wants us to reach perfection, and that the way that we grow is through reincarnation, that we don't only have one physical life, but that we have many physical lives, that we have as many physical lives as it takes for us to grow and learn everything that we need to do. And they also tell us, going back again to the concept of God, that that is a proof of God's love and of the justice of the universe, because clearly we can tell that we're very different from each other. And it will be hard for us to understand the concept of divine justice if we look around just at the physical world and see that some people are born in a much better situation than others. So there is explanations for all those. There are causes and effects, like we talked about before, and oftentimes those causes remount to previous lives. So reincarnation becomes an important component of Spiritism because it lets us understand divine justice as a whole and the world in particular. And that is, for instance, one of the key differentiations that makes Spiritism different than spiritualism. Not all spiritualists, for instance, believe in reincarnation or some of these other things. And that's why oftentimes it's important for us to get these words right, that spiritualism and Spiritism are not the same thing. They have subtle differences that are important for us to know so that we don't get confused and we know exactly what we're talking about. All right. As we go here through our very fast journey through Spiritism, we've talked about spirits, about their nature, the origin, and the destiny, and that alone is enough to revolutionize the way we think about ourselves and our lives. But there's one more component here. There's a relationship to the physical world that Kardec puts in this definition. That's a really important one, because at the end of the day, we are spirits living a physical life. And the interaction between these two realms, it's only possible through mediumship, which, by the way, it's a term that Kardec himself coined. You're not going to find the term medium or mediumship before Kardec. It's one of his many legacies to us. And the concept of mediumship here, it's easy to understand, but sometimes hard to fully internalize. Mediumship is the ability to serve as an intermediary between the physical and the spiritual realms of life. So you can find, you can understand how important this is to Spiritism, because the entire knowledge base that we've gotten from Spiritism has come from mediumship, from this interaction between the spiritual world and the physical world. So it's very important because it's at the root, it's at the center of what Spiritism is. It's not just talking about spirits who are out there in the universe, an abstract thing. It's about us being able to communicate with those who have lived before us and vice versa. So mediumship is also a central part to Spiritism, and some, like myself, would argue that perhaps Spiritism's greatest gift to the world is the very detailed knowledge and study of mediumship. We're going to talk a little bit about this later. Kardec wrote other books, but mediumship is the process through which we can connect with the spiritual world, gain insight from the spiritual worlds, get to know ourselves better. So it's a really powerful piece and central to Spiritism as well. All right. So in the interest of making this very short, let's recap really quickly here then what Kardec brings to us as the definition of Spiritism. So he says that Spiritism is the constant study, the constant scientific study, right? The dynamic body of knowledge that studies spirits in general and wants to find out what are spirits, where do they come from, and where are they going, as well as how is it that they relate to the physical world. And that ought to be a very interesting definition, because in just one short sentence, Kardec seems to be able to pack a whole concept that spans multiple disciplines and that yet remains central to who we are as people and to understand our role here in this planet, which is the fact that we're spirits, that we are constantly evolving, that we should constantly grow in knowledge and in understanding, and that we need to relate to the physical world as well. So very powerful things there. Maybe a good primer for us to start our conversation and discourse in general. And I hope that you can also make the leap here to applying this definition to your life. Because if you think about it, we too ought to constantly grow in knowledge. We too ought to constantly seek more facts and more science and more understanding of the world around us. We too need to constantly study and do this. And we, as spirits, need to realize our true nature, that we are more than this physical body, that we have been created by God, who loves us, who takes care of us, and whose the universe is under God's control, and that we, through our own efforts and through our own process of evolution that is done through reincarnating many times, will eventually achieve happiness and fulfillment because there's a God. So that really fundamentally changes everything that we think of ourselves when we dive a little bit more deeper about Spiritism. And last but not least, that we are also constantly interacting with the spiritual world because we're spirits. And so not to be taken by surprise when we understand that there are spiritual forces at play in our daily lives as well. So what I think is fascinating about this definition, like I said, it's so succinct, so short, yet so deep. And I hope that it whets your appetite, that it kickstarts a conversation about the whole of Spiritism and what Spiritism is and what Spiritism isn't. Because if you come across anything that is related to Spiritism but does not apply a rational perspective, does not study the spirits from a demystifying way, then it's probably not Spiritist. It just claims to be. So interesting conversations for us. I hope that this little video has served as a primer for you, and I look forward to interacting with you on our online sessions and via our platform, so to get the conversation going. Thank you and have a great day.